This is the last session of the Compliance Countdown series. Of course, all these slides and all the recordings are available in Etnara, and if they're not available, we'll make them available very shortly. We'll continue to produce videos and content about mandatory climate reporting, the why and the how on how to do it. Our goal is to formalize partnerships with consultants in this room, and of course, help our end clients getting the work done. You might only been doing parts of this at the moment. You might be doing a full disclosure, but the goal is that whenever you need help or you need resources, we are here to provide and assist you. Let me just go in. All right, so we went through having your readiness assessment checklist done on the session 1 back in August. We've done governance and leadership. We've touched on strategy, which was very dense and intense session. Then the risk management, where we covered how to complete a risk management framework. I've shared that with everyone. If you haven't received it yet, please do let me know and get in contact so we can cover this. And finally, we're on the session of the metrics and targets. This is about setting those ambitions, and also normally will come after you've done everything else and might be in touch with strategy, because depending on what you set, your strategy gets impacted. It was a very good ride and very good cohort to do that with, and I've loved your questions in between sessions, and we'll try to run it again or a version of it next year as well, because our goal is to keep on helping as many people as we can.
And also, just to add something in there, any feedback that you have or anything else that you'd like to see, please let us know, send us an email. We're trying to improve every time we run this time of workshops and make it more and more useful for the audience.
Perfect. Today we're going to cover a quick recap, as always, of the standard, understanding this pillar, answering questions and parts of the disclosures, and of course, our ongoing Q&A. So ask questions at any point and we'll stop and cover what you have asked. By now, you know how to use the chatbot. Raise your hand if needed, or just put it in the Q&A box of Zoom to keep going. Quick recap. As always, as we do this, understand the primary users of the report, understand who will be reading this and who cares about what you are creating. Also understand that this report involves short-term, medium-term, and long-term projections. So it's not a point-in-time snapshot, but it is a projection into the future and how your business will become resilient in the future. And finally, understand that it's about the reader, these primary users, to understand your capacity to have cash, to borrow money, and how much it will cost to borrow that money to become resilient in an ongoing change in climate. This is climate-related risks and opportunities. So be aware it's not just about the negative side, but also how your business can capture the upcoming changes in your company's future. The architecture follows very similar the structure of our workshops. It's about governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. They all have equal importance. However, the rollout of assurance is not the same for every part of the report. On your first year as a Group 1 company, there's limited assurance in different things. Of particular importance, there is limited assurance on scope 1 and 2, and we highly recommend doing those analyses early, getting in touch, with the inventory that you might prepare with Etnara, with your auditor, and get those feedbacks, recommendations early in the process, so you're not rushing it at last minute. Same thing with your governance and how you're preparing that, and the upskilling, and how you've completed your risk management framework and map strategy on top of that. Okay, so have this table embedded in your mind and understand that there's different rollouts depending on your group. The prep for metrics and targets. What should you have in hand for a perfect metrics and target disclosure? This might not be realistic for every single company, but ideally you've already done your risk assessment, you've already done your emissions inventory, you went to scenario analysis, and you've created your short-term, long-term projections of the risks and opportunities, and you have a governance structure set up with people who have control over the disclosure, that need to be upskilled, and also set up a of a climate committee or a risk committee that has oversight to some of these things. Ideally, you have that because when you go and setting those targets and that ambitions, everyone has been involved in the process and is not showing up last minute to your executives or to your board, as it might happen if you rush through it. Things can happen in parallel, of course, and you might have already some idea of what you want to set up, but the more foundations you have to set those targets, the easier it is. And here on the side, we have some recommendations of people to be engaged. Really depends on the size of the organization. You might be a group 2 company that just scraped by in the threshold, therefore you might not have all the roles in your team, or even you might be a group 1 that just made the cutoff and you don't have the robustness of the structure, but you can complement that with external consultants if need be to set up that governance. If you have any questions on that, please let me know. And if, of course, you miss all the sessions and some names might be new to you, please review the other webinars or just get in touch with me. I'm happy to touch on that. Maka will be launching a little quiz to get your brains thinking on this lovely Thursday afternoon.
Yeah, just a warm-up poll to start and to understand where you're standing at the moment. Interesting.
I think being very, very confident will be hard at this point in time. But if you are, please do get in touch with me because I would love to learn from you.
At least everyone knows what it means a bit or what we're talking about and what's required. But yeah, I think it makes sense. Half of the people that are replying are saying they're somewhat confident, and the other half is saying that they're not confident enough. Hopefully after this meeting, there's more. Yeah.
I've just shared the responses, and like Micah, like you said, hopefully by the end of this meeting, we will have a change in results or in the path. And as always, if you are a current client of Nata, Maka is always here to help. So please do reach out to Maka at any point during the preparation of your report or whatever engagement we have agreed upon. Now going deep into what needs to be done. And Maka, can you confirm that you can see the shared results of the warm-up quiz?
Yeah, I can.
Perfect. Awesome. And thanks everyone for participating. Really make life easier. Maka, if I miss anything, please do interrupt me, okay? Entities must disclose their performance and progress towards the targets that they have set. These things include, there's a couple of things, and then there's like sector-specific things that you might have to report on. But as a foundation, your scope 1, 2, and 3 targets, your capital allocation to pursue strategy that you have set up or prevent high risks that you've reported on your risk section, an internal carbon pricing if that's available to you, and of course, which metrics are tied into executive remuneration. This might be quite new to everyone, where now someone that is part of this governance structure having a KPI attached to their payroll in a sense. Therefore, when you go ahead and you try setting up reduction targets and you embed that into someone's remuneration, things become tricky. But just for you to be aware that there is one of the requirements of the legislation in a certain capacity.
And just jumping in there, Fons, because we have a question from Anne. She's asking if organizations may choose not to have any targets. And I will add to that, which one, I mean, if there's some mandatory, which ones, and for example, executive remuneration, that have to come into the first year, second year, how does it work?
Yeah. With all things in this legislation is without undue effort in a sense, as long as you can go to the process and demonstrate that there wasn't capacity to set up that target for some reason, you can try and disclose that. My perspective and opinion on this is, with so much time that has been allocated to go ahead and prepare these disclosures, companies should be confident to set up a target. It might be just a scope 1 and 2 targets. It might be to review how you analyze scope 3 emissions to then set a target. It's not expected that everyone says they're going to be net zero by X date, but there should be an ambition level on how you can deploy some strategy behind that. Because what we want to see is this becoming business as usual, and therefore needs to be embedded in strategy. And for that to be real, it needs a target. I can deep dive offline into specific things that you should and shouldn't do first, but overall, it is expected that companies are publish a target. You might use the new net zero plans released by the government in your industry and see which part of that you can contribute to, and then follow those indicators. Even if some companies believe that they might not be ambitious enough, some might believe that they're overly ambitious. So just take note of that. And this is all about how your company wants to be perceived and what is your mission level as an organization. It's a very sensitive topic as well because of different opinions on how aggressive Australian net zero targets are, if they are high enough to be relevant in a changing climate. The reporting should span multiple teams. And if I didn't answer that question correctly, please do come back to me offline. I'm happy to deep dive into it, or just put it in the chat again. The reporting should span multiple teams to be a good target. And of course, there should be owners, there should be smart targets. But we recommend the sustainability and reporting teams that have been involved in analyzing and preparing the disclosure, management and board, because they'll have to allocate budget to these initiatives. DSG, and of course, you might not have a remuneration committee, but there should be a discussion with HR about how this can trickle down into KPIs of roles whenever you want to hire. Again, let's say you try to expand your team to implement some of the strategies, you should now have those KPIs published as part of the responsibilities of that role. And of course, the auditors who are going to validate initially if your emissions measurements are actually have limited assurance. So you might want to wait on that before you go and you set up your metric, because you might do a pre-assessment or pre-measurement and that's not correct for some reason, and then you might have to tweak that. For example, you might thought that your scope 2 emissions were this much, and then you go to the auditing process and you had to change what the number is, and you might miss an office or a couple months, whatever it might be. That overall emissions might be higher, and then they become higher to reduce, more challenging to reduce. So take note of that in terms of the steps in the process. How is it done? The reporting follows the S2 standard, and of course, the methods for measuring the emissions are the greenhouse protocol or ANGERS. Just understand to which one you have to align with, depending if you're already like an ANGERS reporting organization, but you are required to have limited assurance in year 1 for that scope 1 and 2 data. If you're a professional service, this might be straightforward because you're looking just at your offices, electricity bills, and you might have 6 or 7 offices around Australia and New Zealand, and you don't own any cars of the company, so it might be straightforward. If you are energy producer, logistics, and so forth, things can become more complicated in the process. These metrics that we're going to go over and report on, they need to be consistent and auditable. So don't only think about the final emissions number, think about the metrics that are associated with that and how they were created.
And Fonsa, I'm jumping in there with a question. Let's say that a company is now measuring their carbon footprint for the first time in 2025. Can they choose to put a baseline years before that?
Yes. So your baseline can be a prior baseline, and your target might be the reduction from that point onwards. For that to exist, you need to actually get those numbers of the baseline with limited assurance for it to create those metrics. It doesn't have to be the year of 2025 that you are using for your reduction over time.
Perfect. So if a company has the data for it, they can set their baseline years before.
Correct. But just remember, that auditability needs to be up to this financial year to be reported.
Yeah. And I'm going to take the chance now to launch the next poll to see what emissions data are you currently or your clients currently tracking the most.
You're asking the hard questions, Marco.
I know, right? So I'll share the
While people are answering, there's a question from Warwick, which is, so why don't you include a CFO to get the link between carbon down and cash up strategies, quick wins, and ROI and sustainability investments, more than compliance and box ticking? There's an element here where we've mentioned, I think, in like the people who are involved, which are the finance team. The finance team need to be involved from a sense of setting up the strategy and how much capital it can be deployed to achieve these things. Also, the CFO has final sign-off on these disclosures. From a why perspective, I do believe companies should see this as business as usual, as having an ROI from sustainability initiatives, and that might be highlighted in your risk register in the terms of is actually more efficient or more economically to move a certain warehouse from a risk area to somewhere else to move our inventory and reduce our insurance premium, might be an outcome of this discussion. Therefore, if you go through the process, you will see a monetary benefit from that. The other thing that you might be uncovered from a finance CFO perspective is by carrying on this work, especially in that risk opportunity side, you might go and invest in a new product line, in a new set of customer personas that would want a new product that is more aligned with their values or sustainability opportunity. A good example is in construction. If construction is after green steel or more sustainable cement, if you were to produce that item, you can open doors for new contracts. Same thing if you're contracting with the government. If you meet their tender guidelines by reporting on certain metrics, you might unlock bigger contracts or retain your existing contracts. So I do think not seeing this from a compliance perspective makes for more involvement, more stakeholder opinions, and ultimately a better outcome from the organization from an ROI perspective. CFOs' involvement vary at different organizations. At the end of the day, they will have the final sign-off. We recommend that they involve from a strategic perspective as well. Hopefully, Warwick, that answers your point as well.
And I just share the results so we can see that 50% are actually tracking scope 1 and scope 2, which makes sense, and that's where everyone starts. And we can see only 7% is capturing scope 3 partially.
And we do understand that like scope 3 can be a beast of itself. What we always recommend is do track it at the beginning, at least in a spend-based analysis. So you can then see the materiality of different emissions hotspots and then double down on those that are needed. As mentioned, those KPIs or those metrics also need to be audited as part of limited assurance as part of your disclosure. And things that need to be included are, as an example, your CO2 per revenue unit, as an example, your renewable energy usage, if you do have some energy efficiency gains. So if you are setting up progress, how are you becoming more efficient in your own offices or operations? Any emissions reduction targets, so it might be your scope 2 reduction over time, or maintain, market-based zero emissions guideline by having all of your offices, with PPAs that have renewables associated with that, water use efficiencies, and the range. The list goes on a little bit more, but just be aware that you should report things that are relevant for your business. So once you identify something that is material, picking revenue units or product lines that make sense for your business. The goal is to track your progress toward climate goals, and if that indicator is not related to the goal that you set, becomes a bit irrelevant. A good example that we've discussed from the different sessions into this one, going past your scope 1, 2, and 3, your classic greenhouse gas emissions inventory, is business exposure and opportunities. Maybe to what I was mentioning before to Warwick, is the fact of if you do have assets and exposure to physical and transition risks, what are they, right? I mentioned the example of floods. If you have 3 warehouses, what is the percentage of inventory that can be exposed to a flood event and partially, damaging that inventory? How many product lines are aligned with the climate-related opportunities that you've surfaced during your workshop? We want to understand those things so those can improve over time and show resilience in your business. Capital deployment as well. If we're going to do some of these strategies, can you actually get a monetary number behind that instead of just saying high, low, medium, to actually get, we're going to invest, and we'll show some examples, $1 million into investigating or doing R&D to a product line that will help us capture X opportunity, or we're going to spend $1 million to relocate our warehouses or to train our staff in something. That's what we want to see. Internal carbon price, relevant if you're using that to make decisions and how you move forward over time. And then executive remuneration. How are these climate metrics that we've put out into the world linked to the people who manage them or have final say over them?
Fons, I have a question for you just on that one. If you can go back.
Yeah.
From your perspective, which of those metrics you think people or companies struggle the most to start measuring, and which is an easy way or where to start?
I think the reporting of emissions, it is straightforward. It is a numbers and data availability and execution problem. It can be hard depending on your company structure and size and quality of data, but it's definitely bread and butter and can be done. The exposure of those sites, it is challenging, but because it requires you to actually carry on the work to understand the exposure. And the capital deployment needs the modeling involved with that, and you might not have enough time to go into financial quantification. So you might just say, we're going to try to create a budget into the future. The more personal things that can occur, as an example, if people try to implement no flying policy or change the rules on when executives can fly, business versus economy, on flight length and class, those things actually start becoming very personal, and there's opinions because now their day-to-day and their quality of work changes because of this climate disclosure. And that creates real frictions, which are positives, which brings awareness to the problem, but they're less about data and more about personal decisions on how the business wants to move ahead. And maybe your flights are not that material, but it's something that your business wants to tackle, that have control over, and those discussions start. Same thing with remuneration. Creating new roles, changing internal KPIs can be challenging. Maka will now launch another quiz to keep us all engaged.
There we go. And it's about, so we spoke about metrics, and now we're going to focus a bit more on setting targets, what it means, what it takes, and so on. And if you have any questions, meanwhile, just remember to put them in the group, and we'll try to reply to them as soon as possible. I'm just looking at the results, and I'll share them shortly. There we go. I'm about to share them. So interesting results. Again, we have 50 between regulatory compliance and sustainability goals. And I think this is great because I truly believe regulatory compliance is something that pushes and starts the conversation. But again, as we always say, we need to move from that ticking box to actual actions and awareness.
Exactly. And there's an element of that investor and stakeholder pressure as well. It happens a lot at board level, where board members sit across different organizations and they see an organization setting up targets, doing the disclosure, and they bring that know-how into the other organizations. And you'll see that happen more and more often. Same thing with loans and banks trying to understand the exposure of their investments or their books. And of course, in contracts, requirements of certain metrics and targets to win certain contracts. By now, that should be embedded into your minds. With that said, we're going to move into some examples. Hopefully, they are helpful for you to understand how you might set up a target. Here we get the example of scope 1 and 2 greenhouse emissions. Now we've applied a broad 42% reduction across both, the cumulative for both, according to a 2023 baseline. That breakdown, if you look at that statement, we have the metric to use, which is that CO2 equivalent across scope 1 and scope 2. We have the objective. We want to mitigate the transition if there's an internal carbon price or we're forced to neutralize those emissions over time or set up a science-based target. We're trying to tackle that. The part of the identity, this is across the whole organization, and you should state that, like which part, maybe just if you have multiple regions, you might just say just Australia, just New Zealand. So we want to understand which part of the organization this is relevant, the period, when, and from when. So there's an association with that. Some companies fall into the mistake of saying just a statement of how much they want to reduce, and they don't put the date at the end, by mistake. So making sure that that reduction has a number at the end and at the beginning. Quantifying the target type, if it's an absolute target or it's a comparison target, the scopes covered, and of course the net. So you could then do the calculation of going from 40% onto how much it is. In this case, there's always different ways to approach it. You don't always have to say it's by a percentage. You might say by certain amount of tons quantified. We want to remove, a ton of emissions from our transport disclosure, and that's how that would work. Here are some examples, real life, so not created by us, but actually from large organizations. You can see here the target reduction being 100%, scope 1 and 2, and then setting up the timeline. And then you have, a scope of target that changes depending on what's being tackled. That second line you can see is very precise on what's being included in that 42% reduction. The same thing with mitigations. You can see that the key action, I might zoom in a little bit. The detail now doesn't have a number. The goal is to improving efficiency in using alternative sources. They're saying that they want to invest and go ahead with that. So it's already like linked to strategy, but hasn't been quantified. So a good example, refrigeration, same thing. We want to reduce emission from refrigeration, hasn't been set as a target, just as an intent or a strategy moving forward on how all combined, it will go into 100% reduction.
Yeah, and I think something interesting in this case, as you can see, is that the targets set for scope 1 and 2 and part of scope 3 have one baseline. And then when you look at other parts of scope 3, because we all know sometimes it gets more tricky to properly calculate it, they have changed their baseline from 2015 to 2021. And I think it's in bold in there. But the reason for this is because they got better data, so more accurate calculations. And now they're setting that baseline. So again, my point here, and to summarize, is data accuracy is important, and it's a constant improvement.
Exactly. The fact of improving your processes over time is in itself a win, if that makes sense. To the questions around pressure from Warwick, 100%. I wouldn't say financial gains from the contract itself. So the question is, I'm seeing businesses more interested in financial gains of sustainability, quick wins, and financial returns, and the pressure that is coming with supplier codes of conduct. In this case, you do have a new requirement to win a proposal, win a tender, and therefore they're forcing the businesses to quickly act at the point in time to solve. It is a pressure that I think it's good for businesses because it is forcing them to actually take action, because we're now linking climate with revenue generation activities. And together, that pressure will create more robust businesses, and the ones that over time actually have a relevant strategy that is concrete and has good foundations will continue to win over time. It happens with security. Just because you have an ISO certification doesn't mean you are the most secure business, but are the ones that take that, implement, maintain, and revise, that win over time and have less accidents, as an example. The other question was SBTI or not SBTI, what is the minimum requirement to set a target? There is no minimum requirement to set a target. However, it is all about your ambition as a company. Do you want to perceive as a business who hasn't set a target or who hasn't set an emission reduction? And if you did set one, how realistic it is, and do you show that you have a strategy behind that? That's the important key. disclosing, it's easy. What is challenging is the ambition level that you have as an organization. Setting an SBTI might mean that inherently you are being ambitious about your target, but it really depends on your company and how you want to be perceived and how you want to engage internal stakeholders to go ahead and do this. Here's a final example. On the left, we have improvement. We have the KPI and we have the improvement over time and how on track, color-coded they are with that. Same thing as well. They've set the KPI and have not reported on it. It is okay. It's a fact that the KPI has been set and then they've been transparent on how they're progressing as time moves on. On the right-hand side, we have the data that supplements the KPI. You have the full inventory being disclosed and the sources of emission factors, basically the auditability of that process consolidated into a table. And then, of course, on the left, we have how that maps up. Okay, this is our performance, this is our new performance, and this is the percentage reduction over time. It's a very easy way to show graphically what you're trying to do. It doesn't have to be that complex. You just want to be able to show the criteria that you do have a KPI, you're tracking the performance of the target, and you are year on year disclosing how you are doing against that. This is a repetition of what's said above, but you can screenshot this one and we'll share. It's in a cleaner format, but these are the key metrics to be used. What I do recommend as well is for you to download the disclosure and go look into that if anything are specific into your sector. And if you have any doubts on definitions, on how to do certain things, this section of the disclosure is not that extensive and really maps well to create a robust conversation with your stakeholders. The emissions reporting, this is a snapshot of one of our clients. It doesn't have to be extensive. In here we have a table from 0 that has all the details, all the information. This is best practice. You might want to consolidate that into a table. And if you're only reporting at this level of granularity, you can put it in this way. Of course, you are forced to do your market-based and location-based. But I just want to say, when you do see these tables in public reports, understand that there is a lot of work behind this. So it's not just about publishing the table, it's about the auditability of the work behind it, okay? When you go into the emissions reporting, so we've talked about targets, now we go about the preparation of the information that you need to set up those targets. This is what has been done most often, what most people are familiar with, which is the measurement of carbon emissions or creating your inventory. I do recommend to do this work in parallel with other business activities. However, just because you're familiar with carbon emissions in the past, do remember that you now have some auditability behind that. So you'll need to really document your systems and your processes and your methods behind the numbers that you're putting out. We help setting up emissions boundaries, reports for our clients, which really details what's going to be included and excluded, and then you can use that to report. A good example here is by using the system, once we go with the emissions boundary assessment, you can create that and you get a shareable link. And with a shareable link, you can share with your internal stakeholders to get that information reviewed. And if everyone is okay with that, we include the notes or the offices and regions that are going to be included. We include operational boundaries as part of your scope 1, 2, and 3, and that is specific to what it applies to. So really easy way to get a snapshot of what's included in those final numbers. Even if you don't use NetNata, make sure you create something similar in an Excel spreadsheet and you create notes to everything that has been included and excluded as part of your measurement. This is what sits behind your report that you might choose not to publish, but you need to send it to auditors. One thing that I brought up is the key element of, Mac asked me, what is hard to do? I believe emissions are now easier with systems like NetNata and others and professional consultants, but it is the fact of reporting these assets exposure. And if you attended the other sessions, you would understand a bit more about how it works. But doing the assessment of what has been mapped out in your enterprise risk management framework and disclose that is really important, because as an investor, as a reader of your report, I want to understand if you've done it in a good way and what the outcomes of those assessments. And this might be a percentage of, might be linked to financial planning if you have the capability, and linked to opportunities that you might have. A good example might be saying, we've carried on the assessment and we've uncovered an opportunity to create a new product given R&D that's going to expose us to XYZ clients. That's what we want to see. And this is hard to do. So do spend time doing these assessments, and do consult externally if needed to really be able to report on these metrics. Here's an example. What portion of the assets or activities are vulnerable? Your metric might be that amount and percentage of assets who are vulnerable to climate-related physical risks. How you disclose that could be in a statement like this. Doesn't have to be complex. You might have enough capacity to actually put a number behind it. If you don't have the capacity, you can say it's high exposure, or it's significant, or it's material, or it's not material, and therefore we're not going to do anything about it. So 10% of our assets are exposed to severity of storms and flooding. Super clear, makes the reader aware that you carried on the assessment, and on the back of that you understood that there was some financial quantification being able to do.
And just to repeating that, I think it's important to, we've been saying this through all the sessions, but it's important to be able to show how you got to that 10%, how you got to that number. So remember always, like, whatever it's public, there's a lot of things behind the scenes. There's a lot of work that needs to be shown to be auditable.
Perfect. Thanks for that reminder. Same thing with the emissions, and the same thing applies to all the metrics and targets. The other aspect of this is showing how integrated these targets are into financial planning. And of course, without undue effort, we want to be able to link these targets and this exposure into how much it's going to cost to achieve those. So ideally, we'll have what are going to be, the budget necessary to reduce scope 1 and 2 emissions. Do you have to buy new technologies, invest in solar panels, move offices, all of those things? Finally, also, how do you influence investment as part of procurement? So this is the last line here. We say to clients that sometimes setting a threshold of a contract or setting a threshold of investment will trigger how you then review your targets, and if that's going to push you further to the target or far away from it. You might have a business opportunity, but you do a quick assessment, and by pursuing that, you're going to trigger increasing emissions in scope 2 by X, let's say opening a new office. Then you might take a step back and say, actually, let's go from this office to an office with a higher neighbors rating and get a PPA with renewable energies, so our scope 2 remains at 0 or reduces over time. That's what we want to see as readers of that report and how that has been embedded. We want decisions that make you closer towards your targets, not further away from it. This is another example, very simple one, and I'll focus on things that are in bold. But the metric is a description of the considerations that have been factored into executive remuneration. It is a hard one. It gets complex, but in bold, and there's some good examples, I think, from Starbucks that have been released and a couple others. But for example, 15% of total STI awards is directly linked to achieving specific climate-related performance indicators. Those things might be reduction in greenhouse gas emissions milestones. If you say that by 2030, you are going to achieve scope 2 equals 0, you might have an interim target that tracks or triggers financial bonus or reward from that. That will force teams to keep on moving and to keep on committing to that role over time. Becomes very personal. It's very new, especially if leadership is not involved, but just be aware that we're expecting some level of adaptation into financial planning and into remuneration of executives. The other thing is that capital deployment. I've mentioned the example of warehouses. I mentioned the example of offices, but how much CapEx do you actually need to support those goals? A good example is how much would it actually cost you to go from a lease in a building without neighbors rating to move to a building with a high neighbors rating? You might have to pay a premium for the space. We want to be able to make sure that the company has taken on that assessment, not just saying the number, but actually has the funds over time to do that. The climate risk and financing decisions, same thing. If you're going to buy a new asset, we give the example of insurance all the time. What is going to be the insurance premium associated with going into an asset that might have some climate risk involved with that, and how you factoring in those things. That's what we want to, if you have that, like I said, without undue effort, if you do have the time to understand and report on the capital deployment strategies alongside your targets.
And Franz, we have a question here from David, more related to risks, actually. What he's asking is, how might you answer the question about vulnerability to transition risks?
David, can you expand on that question if that's possible? I'm not sure if I can fully understand it. Might be my bad.
Or maybe, David, what you mean is how would you show your vulnerability across time? Anyways, let us know so we can reply to that.
Finally, we saw this, we're getting to the end, but just understanding that how you track is as important as how you report on emissions. And we saw the example of zero in those tables, but we want to see not just the number, we want to see the emission factors, the type of activity, the boundaries that have been included, and just be aware that's going to be some internal review to be done, hopefully before you go into external assurance. You want to describe things like which systems you use and who was helping you. Scope 1, measure directly or estimated. So are you using some square meterage equivalent, or are you looking at electricity bills? Scope 3, which has been included and why? Is there some materiality behind your decisions? And in which methodologies? Where are these emission factors coming? You might be using some UK emission factors for a different region, extrapolating your Australian emissions. That's what we're going to see in those methods documents. Perfect. All right, we have an expansion now from David. The clarification is, you use an example about physical risks, 10% of assets. I did do that. But do you need to answer the same question regarding transition risks? And if so, what might be a reasonable answer? So you don't have to quantify things financially for everything, but you might say that there is no transition risks for the short term. And then in the meantime, you're going to investigate the impact on your balance sheet of the medium and long-term transition risks for your company. So you can buy yourself some time in that matter. But ideally, you might see, if you're forced to offset some of your emissions as a part of transition risk, what is going to be the cost of doing those? If you have to now spend more time on external consultants to engage and get product life cycle assessments done on products that you sell into the construction industry, you might want to document how much it's going to cost per year. It might be you need $300,000 more to analyze your key product lines. This is something that might be happening in the fashion industry as well. Certain product lines might need to get assessed from a portfolio perspective. Same thing in assets. So I would see it in that way. And if it's more the quantification of taking on maybe the external consulting to do that work. Hopefully that answers. If companies are not sure about the transition risk in quantifying that to begin with, you might say that as part of your strategy, you're going to go and quantify what that might look like. But we want to show that you're not just stopping because you haven't done it, that you're showing that you're doing it into the future. This is some examples of footnotes in the report. I might zoom in a little bit. What we're seeing here is that in a client report, you were adding in information in footnotes, like you've done in financial reporting, of who's done what has been involved, what is some of the methodology, and you're putting that in your public report as part of your disclosure. And here an example is a table that kind of highlights, similar to what we saw in the zero report, your scope 1, 2, and 3, and the emissions category, the activity that has been included, the data sources, was it modeled, was it invoices, was it a general ledger, and then of course emission factor sources, methodology, and any notes. It's an easy table to kind of publish, might be a bit harder to construct because you need to spend some time understanding what's going to be used. If you use a consultant that has done it in the past, or systems like NetNata, it's kind of very easy to start filling in the gaps and understand what is missing. And of course, all the systems will provide you the information that you need to construct a table like this. This is an example in Etnara, in your audit table. Once you run the calculations, you can actually understand and download all these details into your system to send it to an accountant, to send it to an auditor, or actually do your own pivot charts, pivot tables, whatever it's needed. But understanding that it's not just a black box, but every calculation and every emission factor has been saved and used as part of that. Really important if you are picking a system or working with someone, clarify if they're going to provide you with the information or the methods and the documentation to create those tables that you just saw in the previous slides.
And I have the last poll to lunch. 10 minutes before we finish. There we go. I'll share the results in a second. Thank you very much, everyone, for contributing.
Perfect.
We're still getting some answers. Okay, there we go.
There's a very interesting question in the chat, which I'll take the time to answer right now, which is, we supply IT equipment, but it's all manufactured overseas, right? When working out the climate risk, do we consider those climate risks overseas, which could impact our manufacturing plants? My advice to this is look at the financial impact in your business that might occur if there is a disruption in that manufacturing, okay? So your goal, if you do assess that you have one plant in one location and that's going to be exposed to maybe more days of disruption from heat waves or whatever it might be, or any transition risk that actually occurring where those goods are being produced, I will take that into account, because as an investor, as a bank, I want to make sure that you are preparing yourself. If there are disruptions, how are you going to mitigate them? This might involve having 2 factories now. Might involve that you've assessed the risks and today you're willing to expose yourself to a certain amount of risk without allocating or changing factories in the next 5 years. However, the same thought that you shared in that comment is what you expected to investigate and come back with an answer if the risks are real and they are of a high threshold that requires you to take an action as a sustainability committee or whoever is involved in making these decisions. That's what we want to see. Those questions that you are asking is what you have to investigate as part of your disclosure. And you might come back with a no. It's not a risk at the moment. It won't be a big impact. Even if there's a 10-day disruption, we have 6 months worth of inventory, and we can use that in the meantime. If there's now, instead of lead time being 6 months, is now 8 months. That's what we want to construct as a narrative, and to have confidence if you can tackle that. We've tackled this already. The steps to be taken to track and progress your emissions reduction. Same thing, interim targets, tied to executive performance, and to adjust the strategy over time. Capital investment and where it's directed. As we touched on the past, that office's example, exposure to climate risk, dollar value directed to green investments as an example, spending align, if we identify the risk, what do you do afterwards, adaptation and mitigation, and then that classification of CapEx related to climate matters. Ideally, that's what we're seeing. We see in larger companies things like we're deploying, $10 million funds to R&D to do X in assurance, and you might have something like we're deploying $1 billion to track or reduce our exposure to, climate liabilities. All those things might happen. If your organization is smaller, just be realistic on how you can disclose and commit a certain amount of money. It might start by internally spending money on upskilling to build a team to then tackle the problems further. Okay? It doesn't have to be big statements to begin with. Just be aware of what your other peers are doing, what your industry are doing, and the role that you have to play in that. Here's an example. Deploy 70 million of capital, right? It is a big commitment. You might track towards it, you might overdo it, you might underdo it, but it's an example of a target with the financial value associated with that. Your company doesn't have to do that, but you might see that you might want to build a team or the capability or the resources internally or externally to tackle your climate-related opportunities. That's on you to decide. Of course, you can get advice on it, but just be aware that this could be those one big statements that then can be expanded behind the scenes on how you are getting there. Why did you decide on that number? Why did you decide on 2030? Might be based on your peers, might be based on like the opinion and the materiality of like CFOs and the board. It really depends. There's no one way to go about it. But just be aware that then the breakdown of the target still need to be really evident. So don't say 70 million in capital expenditure. You need to put that is for opportunities by 2030. That's the quick wrap around it. There was a lot to cover. One thing that I recommend you to do as actionable steps is review your inventory and what has been measured. And if you were confident that you will have limited assurance on scope 1 and 2, understand if you are using a platform, if it's going to provide you with the information that you need to run those checks and to create that inventory emissions boundary. Understand if you have enough stakeholders involved to go and set these targets, that you're not working by yourself, and look for inspiration in peers, in other public reports, and the way that they're setting targets, and understand if those will be translatable to your own organization, or if they can be a foundation of the work that you're going to do. Those will be my 4 main advices. The last one is specifically on emissions measurements. If you haven't carried on an assessment with a platform or with a consultant that would meet limited assurance, do it now as a practice run. They're getting more affordable by the day. Technology like ours helps, but it builds you some confidence to then go back to the board, go back to your stakeholders to go and set those targets with some foundations behind it.
Yeah, and actually just to add there, if any of you want to see how another platform works, you want a quick demo or anything, just feel free to send me or Afonso an email, and I'm happy to jump in a call and just walk you through the platform. If you want to compare, if you want to see how it works and so on, we're super happy to show it.
Perfect. There's a question, another question in the chat. I'll copy that and I'll reply to you offline, just given time. I just want to say that there is a bunch of resources that are available. There's tools, there's our academy, and I just want you to be aware that while the core of what we do is that software and consulting, just be aware that there's a lot of resources that are available to you to get going. If you don't know where they are, do message us. It has been a phenomenal pleasure to do this session, but also all the sessions before this one. And it's the second time we've run it. If you have any feedback to myself and Maka, any feedback from Etnara, and you want to formalize a partnership as a consultant with us, please reach out at any point. Maka, did I miss anything?
I don't think so. And I think we can maybe give people back 2 minutes from their day.
I don't expect everyone to be able to do a full disclosure by doing the sessions, but hopefully you now are more educated to start the conversations and to understand what you need to procure, buy, hire, train, and get more confidence with the overall process. We're here to help.
And thank you very much for participating, for replying to the polls, making questions. I think that's, it makes it easier for us as well.